Our third speaker in this session is Ben Farger, who's no doubt well known to a lot of people in the room. Ben's the General Manager Origination for Cargill Australia. Prior to that he had a stint with Primag, and prior to that of course he was the Chief Executive of the National Farmers Federation, where he no doubt got his hands dirty on many occasions trying to deal with trade issues. So please welcome Ben.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for the opportunity, Mick and the Australian Farm Institute, and it's great to be here with so many people that have got an expertise in this region and in these markets, which is fantastic. More on that in a sec. Just a quick introduction. I work at Cargill. Cargill is a diversified agribusiness in Australia, so we have various businesses. We've got a beef business in a joint venture with Tees, and there's a gentleman, Charlie, from Tees here today. We've got a cotton business. We've heard a bit about cotton today. And we recently acquired a malting business in Joe White Maltings. In 2011 we acquired AWB, so we're in the grains and oilseed business. We've got a 40% share with GrainCorp in Allied Mills, and we also have a subsidiary of Cargill, a hedge fund, Black River Agricultural Management, that has activity in Australia, as well as some specialty seeds and oils and a refined oils Asia Pacific business. So we are invested in Asia Pacific, we're invested in Australia. And I'm not working in market in Southeast Asia. I'm not working with flour millers in Indonesia, and I'm not a trader of agricultural commodities in Southeast Asia. I work with growers. I work on the commercial side of our business with growers in Australia, buying grain, working with growers on risk management products, working with growers on specialty programs for malt or high-lac canola into Asian markets. I manage the storage and handling part of our business, which is 22 upcountry sites. So I guess, why am I here? Certainly not an expert in the region. Why am I here if I work with growers talking about Southeast Asia? Well, that's the point. That's the point. I'm here because that's the consumer base. That's the opportunity, and I want to learn more about it. Not just only on behalf of Cargill, but as someone interested and passionate about Australian agribusiness, I want to learn more about it. Because when I close my eyes and I hear that the OECD says that by 2030, 2/3 of the global middle class will live in Asia, when I close my eyes and open my eyes and think it's now 2030, I want to know what it looks like. I want to know what it looks like, and I want to know what we, as a business, Cargill, as an industry, Australian agriculture, need to do now to be able to realise that opportunity. And so that's why I'm here today. I also want to challenge us and challenge the Farm Institute, because it's a policy forum with so many people sitting in the room that have got expertise about how we can work now together to realise some of that opportunity and what some of the policy settings that Mick and other colleagues can get involved in. So I'll do some of that as well. In that regard, I'm not going to focus a lot on the market overview, because you've either been there, know it, lived there, trade there, and you've heard a lot of the speakers today talk about the opportunity in these markets. But there's huge population growth, middle income's growing, as you all know, and diets are changing. So in these ASEAN markets, which is what I've been tasked to talk about today, you're aware that we're moving away from that rice-based diet into a more cereal-based diet, and that provides a lot of opportunity for the Australian grains industry. ASEAN countries don't grow a lot of wheat, and we do. And so there's potential opportunities for us going forward to really engage more in those markets around our cereal base, around our flour-based products. And as you can see there, Southeast Asia already accounts for 60% of Australian wheat exports, Indonesia being our largest market, and Vietnam being our second largest market. The feed complex is also important, so I'm going to talk a lot today about cereals and milling and flour in Southeast Asia, but the feed complex is very important in terms of global trade flows. And you can see that maize dominates coarse grain consumption in ASEAN member states, and you can see the growth in consumption in that area as part of the protein story, principally around pork and poultry. Oilseeds are also important, and Charlie from the dairy talked about oilseeds today. He talked about soy, and of course, a country like Indonesia produces a lot of palm oil in their own right. And Cargill's got a large palm oil business in Indonesia. Indeed, we employ 22,000 people in Indonesia across 6 businesses, not just trading, not just flour milling. We have a large palm business in Indonesia. So I'm a very visual person, so this is just a couple of charts to illustrate the growth. But as I say, this is not the focus of my talk today. Judith talked about not forgetting horticulture. Well, certainly you can't with that chart. It's very, very stark, the growth in consumption in ASEAN countries. You can see cereals on the chart there. We've certainly seen a swing towards Asia in regard to wheat exports. And there's a lot of factors at play in this chart. So we have marked, well, the deregulation's been marked there, and there's certainly a different dynamic after deregulation of the grains industry in Australia. A lot more containerised product going into Asia rather than just bulk vessels, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's not just about deregulation. It's not just about the growing population. It's also about global trade flows, about the exchange rate, about the cost of freight, and all these dynamics, as well as competitive emerging markets like in the Black Sea region that contribute to this type of global demand and supply dynamic. And it really is a global demand and supply dynamic at play. When you see wheat exports into Southeast Asia, certainly they've been growing, and the production at home, of course, and droughts in Australia have an impact on this as well. And we're hearing now about an El Nino event. How is that going to impact on the supply of high quality produce from Australia this year? Many of the last panel talked about that supply and being able to guarantee that supply. Certainly a big impact. And you can see the prevalence of the containerised trade into Southeast Asia there. In terms of wheat exports, I mentioned it, but Indonesia being our largest market, and Vietnam certainly being extremely important as well as those other Asian member countries there. Barley, I'll talk a little bit about barley in a minute, not just because Cargill's now in the malt business, because there is an interesting dynamic globally happening with malt as well as feed barley, and that's certainly something interesting and an opportunity for Australian agriculture and a company like Cargill in Australia. And then canola as well. We don't necessarily always think about canola in regard to ASEAN countries, but we certainly are seeing growth, albeit from a very low base and albeit a very different quantum from, say, wheat into Indonesia. But canola, depending on the price, can price into feed rations, including into the poultry ration. So that's it for the market dynamic. Very short, one, because you know it, and two, because I want to focus on other challenges around trends and what some of the competitive dynamic is. I've intentionally put this chart there in regard to key trends, because you'll see pastries and sweet pastries and bread products there, which is a change in Southeast Asia. It's very important to remember, and I know many of you will know this, but wheat is not wheat, and there are certainly different quality characteristics, different attributes of grains and wheat, different protein levels that go into the milling process in Southeast Asia and impact on the type of consumption and the type of demand that the customer would want in Asia. And Australian grains are a certain type of high quality, clean, white grain, different from grain in North America that often has a much higher protein, and so you're going into a different segment of the market. So wheat is used for noodles, bread, biscuits, confectionery, and I've broken down some of the segments there in regard to what the flour segments are, and certainly the noodle segment is an extremely large segment, and it's one that we in Australia target very heavily. So our market is that noodle wheat, that ASW, APW wheat, as distinct from the much higher protein cereals that often come from North America into Southeast Asia. So that's certainly a dynamic, but that dynamic will change as we see more Western diets and as we see the bread segment growing, not just in regard to noodles, but bread, certainly a lot of growth in noodles as well, and into more snack foods as well. So some of the grain out of North America and countries like Canada is a different protein, a different characteristic to Australia. There's other countries in the world and other regions like the Black Sea that directly compete against our APW, ASW wheat. And certainly at the moment, freight rates for those commodities globally, or the global freight rates, are very low because of energy, oil, etc. In fact, they're the lowest they've been for some time. Not just bulk, but containerised freight. So the geographic advantage we have on Southeast Asia's doorstep is eroded when freight rates are so low, which means our competition is up. And so to think that we can sit and take our proximity, our geographic proximity for granted would be a mistake. And we'll get to more on that later. Barley. The consumption of beer is growing rapidly in Southeast Asia, and in Australia we've got the second largest malt production capacity in Asia. So that's an opportunity for us, and I'll put a slide up later that shows some of that consumptive growth in beer consumption in Southeast Asia. Having said that though, many of the global brewing industry is managed by several large global brewers, and they've got extremely specific variety and quality attributes, and they can source that product from multiple locations. And they do. And when freight rates are low, they will do that even more. So certainly we can't take, again, that geographic proximity for granted. And I mentioned canola and the story around canola before. The other thing I think that's very interesting in Southeast Asia, and a challenge I would have for policy and a group like AFI on this, is around the dynamic of supermarkets, hypermarkets, and the distribution channels in Southeast Asia. So we're working with flour millers across Southeast Asia. Some of our competitors are buying flour millers in Southeast Asia. And many global companies now are looking at linking up their supply chains. Cargill does this. Many of our competitors do this. Japanese companies are doing this in Southeast Asia now. So they're looking at where they originate their grain and how they work through the supply chain to the customer. And so because of the ever-growing prevalence of supermarkets in Southeast Asia, how will that dynamic impact on the distribution system in Southeast Asia? And how is Australian grain a part of that dynamic? Not just working with the flour millers, but through the disaggregated distribution system to the consumer. We know that in Western countries, the retail dominance is extremely high. Is that trend going to continue markedly in Southeast Asia? And how are we going to operate in that environment? Are we going, as a country, as companies in Australia, are we going to purchase those supply chain opportunities in Southeast Asia? Are we going to partner with supply chain partners in Southeast Asia? Are we going to build assets in Southeast Asia to interact through that supply chain dynamic? And that's about the end of the talk, because I can't get the next slide to work. Yes, I can. And that's, when your slides don't work, what do? You have a beer. And that's what this chart would show. Just look at some of the growth rates of beer consumption in Southeast Asia. So I point particularly to Vietnam. We're talking, I don't expect you to look at all the numbers, but if you look at the second last column, percentage beer growth 2015 to 2020, Vietnam, nearly 30% growth rate. Amazing numbers. Laos, 21% growth rate. Sri Lanka, 20% growth rate. So we're seeing a huge increase in consumption in beer in Southeast Asia. And as I said before, we have a large malt capacity in Australia, obviously a large capacity in China as well, with a different market dynamic on the consumption side there as well. But there's certainly an opportunity for us in terms of barley, malt, not just feed barley globally. We're looking to take advantage of that opportunity in our purchase of Joe White maltings. But the quality characteristics are extremely high. And it's about trying to get the market signal from the consumer to the grower and vice versa. It seems logical that that's what we would do, but it is not always the case. And I talk to growers, and growers say to me, if only we knew exactly what the brewer and the maltster wanted so we could look at growing that variety. And I talk to maltsters and brewers that will say to me, if only we could get access to the grower so that we could get them to grow the variety that we want because we know exactly what we want. How do we link up that supply chain from the grower to the consumer, from the Australian grower to the consumer in Southeast Asia? How do we get that market signal? And that's where a company like Cargill should be able to add value in the supply chain. And if you're doing that, as a grower, you're getting a premium often for your product. You're no longer in the commodity business, you're in the specialty malt business. And that's a huge opportunity for a grower to give him or her confidence to invest in their business, to give a company like Cargill confidence to invest in the supply chain, to give the end-use customers confidence that they're going to get the variety they want at the specification they want and when they want it, to get the product to the consumer. So that's some of the opportunities. The growth opportunity, you know about. The demographic opportunity, you know about. Some of the specific changing diet and quality characteristic opportunities we've discussed now. The question is how we take advantage of that and what some of the competitive threats are around that. Our market share is large in Southeast Asia. But if I can get one point across today, it's that if we take it for granted, the world, in terms of global demand and supply, is such a competitive environment that we would do that at our peril. The Black Sea region in particular, the USDA forecast will account for 30% of the global wheat trade by 2023. This is an area that has productive land, that is investing in that area, that has global freight dynamic at the moment being low, giving them much opportunity. And they are growing varieties that compete directly with Australian varieties into some of these markets. So there's certainly a very, very competitive dynamic around the Black Sea region. I was in Canada 3 weeks ago. We're good at farming in Australia, but by gee, you know they are good at farming in North America. And they are investing in supply chains. They're working globally. They're working on their varieties. They're involved in sustainability of their supply chain in the cereal industry. They are formidable competitors. Freight rates are low. They're not sitting there on their hands and saying, well, Australia with their proximity to Southeast Asia is a market for them. It's competitive. It's competitive. And you add the global dynamic around the exchange rate and futures markets and how these global trade flows work, and we have to stay focused in Australia if we're going to compete longer term. Our cost of production in Australia, while competitive, is still not as low as other countries in the world. And you see Russia there on the left-hand side in terms of some cost of production work that we've done recently. And you can see that their cost of production's low, they're good at farming, they're getting better, they're investing in technology, they're coming. And we need to be prepared for that, and we need to be ever vigilant in that regard as Australian agriculture. Market access is important, and certainly we are very, very pleased that market access into Southeast Asia is getting better through the free trade agreements. If I speak to my colleagues who are trading in Southeast Asia, I must say that the dynamic is quite liberal for cereals in Southeast Asia, so the applied rates of tariffs in Southeast Asia are often quite low. These countries, I might say, don't produce a lot of wheat, as I said in my second or third slide. And pleasingly also, the market access non-tariff barriers are also quite conducive to trade on the whole. Now, there are issues in Southeast Asian countries we need to contend with, and Charlie mentioned permits, testing, residue limits, import protocols, and we deal with that in cereals as well, of course. But those incidents of major issues have been low, and the industry is working through the Grain Market Advisory Forum and with the government to manage that dynamic. I, in fact, had to search for an issue in Indonesia through one of my colleagues who explained to me about a Talesia fungus that has been an issue for our Indonesian consumers, that the industry has been quite proactive on. But I certainly don't have a list for you to put on that screen, and I think that's extremely pleasing. So that's my 15 minutes, Mick. And in summary, the demand is huge. You know that. You know that. Diets are changing. You know that. But it's a competitive environment. And countries like Canada, countries in the Black Sea, are good at farming too. And we need, as a country and as businesses like Cargill, to remain extremely focused on those supply chains and how we get the product that the consumer wants, in the specification that they want, and the variety that they want, in a cost-competitive way into these markets. And through all the different products that we've spoken about today, not just in terms of bulk, but the premium dynamic. So that when we woke up and open our eyes in 2030, we can realise the opportunity that a region like ASEAN or Southeast Asia will present to us. Thanks for listening.